For 6 years, Mason Fletcher lived in absolute silence. His father, a Hells Angels president, spent everything trying to fix it. Dozens of doctors, thousands of dollars, zero results. Then, a homeless 10-year-old girl with no medical training walked up to him in a park, reached into his ear, and did the impossible. In 30 seconds, he heard sound for the first time in his life. But what that biker did for that homeless girl 60 seconds later, that's the part you never saw coming. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story. Daddy. The word hung in the air like a question mark shaped from hope alone. Mason Fletcher's lips formed the sound carefully, deliberately. His voice was soft, tentative, reaching out into a world he had never truly experienced. Rick Fletcher heard it, but Mason didn't. He couldn't hear anything. Not the rustle of his father's leather jacket as he turned toward him. Not the gentle creak of the floorboards beneath his boots. Not even the sound of his own voice calling out. For 6 years, Mason had lived in absolute silence. A silence so complete that every word he spoke was nothing more than an educated guess. He remembered the shape of Daddy on his lips because he'd practiced it 1,000 times, watching his father's face light up each time he said it, trusting that he'd gotten it right. But he had never heard it. Not once. Rick stood there in the doorway of their small Portland home, watching his 6-year-old son try to navigate a world that existed only in silence. His jaw tightened, not from anger, not from frustration, but from a pain so deep it had carved permanent lines into his weathered face. This was a man who'd survived decades in the Hells Angels, a man who carried scars from fights, highways, and losses that would have broken most people. Rick Ironside Fletcher wasn't a man easily shaken, but watching his son live in silence, that shook him every single day. Mason tilted his head slightly to the right, the way he always did when the discomfort came. His small fingers reached up, tapping gently against his ear, trying to ease some invisible pressure that had been there for as long as anyone could remember. He winced, just barely, but Rick caught it. He caught everything. He'd spent thousands of dollars trying to fix this. Audiologists, specialists, neurologists, ENT doctors with impressive credentials and even more impressive bills. They'd all taken his money. They'd all run their tests. They'd all offered their theories: nerve damage, congenital defect, developmental delay, structural abnormality. The medical jargon came fast and clinical, but the answers never did. Every appointment ended the same way, with shrugs, apologies, and another referral to yet another specialist who couldn't help. By the time Mason turned 6, Rick had seen 17 different specialists. He'd spent over $40,000 on appointments, tests, scans, and consultations. He'd traveled to Seattle, San Francisco, even Los Angeles, chasing recommendations and second opinions. Every single one of them looked at Mason's ear. Every single one of them missed what mattered. What they didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that every specialist failed to see what a 10-year-old girl would spot in seconds. So Rick did what he rarely allowed himself to do. He took a day off. He pushed aside the club business, the rides, the brotherhood obligations. He dressed Mason in his favorite blue shirt, packed a small bag with snacks and juice boxes, and decided to take him to the neighborhood park. Maybe the sunshine would help. Maybe the swings would bring him joy. What Rick didn't know was that the answer to 6 years of silence was already there, waiting, sitting on a worn wooden bench just 20 feet from where they'd soon stand. And it wasn't a doctor. It was a 10-year-old homeless girl who'd learned to survive by noticing what everyone else missed. If you've ever watched someone you love struggle with something you can't fix, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next proves that sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places. 3 miles across Portland, another child was fighting a completely different battle, one of survival. Sophia didn't remember her father's face anymore. Not clearly anyway, just fragments. The warmth of his hand holding hers, the sound of his voice reading bedtime stories, the way he'd stroke her hair when nightmares scared her. What she did remember with painful clarity was the night the shelter caught fire. She was 7 years old. The smoke alarm screamed through the building, pulling families from their cots, sending everyone scrambling toward the exits in panic. Sophia remembered her father pushing her forward, his hands firm on her shoulders, guiding her through the chaos toward safety. She made it out. He didn't. They told her it was smoke inhalation. They told her he didn't suffer. They told her a lot of things that were supposed to make a 7-year-old feel better about losing the only person who'd ever loved her. None of it helped. Her mother lasted another 8 months. 8 months of showing up drunk, then not showing up at all. 8 months of broken promises and empty apologies, until one morning Sophia woke up in their motel room and her mother was just gone. No note, no explanation, no goodbye. Sophia was 8 years old and she was completely alone. Most kids would have panicked, would have gone to authorities, to child services, to anyone who might help. But Sophia had learned early that the system didn't always work the way people claimed it did. So Sophia made a different choice. She chose to survive on her own terms. She didn't beg. Something in her, pride maybe, or her father's voice still echoing in her memory, refused to hold out her hand and ask for pity. She didn't steal either. Her father had taught her better than that. Instead, Sophia learned to help. She'd hover near diners during the morning rush, offering to bus tables or sweep floors in exchange for breakfast. She'd linger behind barber shops, helping elderly barbers carry out trash, earning a few dollars and sometimes a sandwich. She lived in the corners of life, the spaces between buildings, the alleys behind restaurants, the park benches that nobody else wanted. She kept herself clean as best she could using gas station bathrooms. She wore the same faded jeans and hand-me-down shirts until they were threadbare. And she learned to be invisible. But here's what happened. When Sophia became invisible to everyone else, she started seeing things other people missed. Sophia had a gift nobody knew about, a gift born from desperation. She could read pain in people's faces, the slight wince of an old woman with arthritis, the way a construction worker favored his left leg, the exhaustion in a waitress's eyes after a double shift. Sophia saw suffering because she knew it intimately. 6 months earlier, behind a diner on Morrison Street, she noticed an elderly man sitting on a milk crate, tilting his head and tapping his ear in obvious discomfort. "Something stuck in there," the old man had muttered. "Been driving me crazy for days." Sophia had looked, and there, just visible in the ear canal, was a hardened mass of wax and debris compacted so tightly it had become a blockage. Her father had once helped a neighbor with the same problem, using warm water and patience. She'd helped the old man that day, carefully, gently, and when the blockage finally came free, the relief on the man's face was immediate. Sophia never forgot that moment. If you can't stand how children like Sophia are forgotten by society, comment "Every child deserves a home" down below. And that memory was about to save a little boy's world. The park on West Burnside wasn't much. A few swings with rusted chains, a slide that had seen better decades, patchy grass that turned brown every summer. But it was quiet. Rick pulled his truck into the gravel lot, killed the engine, and looked over at Mason in the passenger seat. The boy was already unbuckling himself, his eyes bright with excitement. Mason ran ahead toward the swings, his blue shirt catching the sunlight. Rick followed at a slower pace, his mind still turning over the latest failed doctor's appointment from 3 days earlier. 20 feet away, sitting on a worn wooden bench near the basketball court, Sophia watched them arrive. She'd been there for about an hour, her usual spot when she needed somewhere to rest during the day. As Mason walked past her toward the swings, Sophia noticed immediately the way his head tilted slightly to the right, the casual, almost unconscious movement of his hand reaching up to tap at his ear, the exact angle of discomfort she'd seen before. Sophia sat up straighter. Mason climbed onto the swing, his father pushing him gently from behind. He smiled, but every few seconds, his hand would drift back to his right ear. The tapping, the gentle pressure he applied with his fingertips. Sophia's eyes narrowed. She leaned forward on the bench, watching more carefully now. The sunlight hit Mason's face at just the right angle as he turned his head. And that's when Sophia saw it, deep inside his ear canal, barely visible, but unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. A dark mass, compacted, lodged firmly. The kind of blockage that wouldn't come out on its own. The kind that could cause pressure, discomfort, and if it was positioned just right against the eardrum, complete hearing loss. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She knew exactly what that was. She'd seen it before. She'd removed one before. And suddenly, with a clarity that sent electricity through her entire body, she understood. This little boy wasn't just uncomfortable. He was deaf because of that blockage. And nobody, not his father, not the doctors, not anyone, had seen it. Sophia's heart started pounding. Her hands gripped the edge of the wooden bench until her knuckles turned white. She could help him. She knew she could. It would take 30 seconds, maybe less. One careful extraction, and that little boy could hear for the first time in who knows how long. But Sophia also knew what would happen if she approached him. She'd spent 2 years learning to be invisible precisely because approaching people, especially children, when you look like she did was dangerous. The father was right there, a big man, intimidating. The kind of man who wouldn't hesitate to protect his son from a strange barefoot girl with scraped knees and unwashed clothes. If Sophia approached him, the man might grab her, might hurt her, might call the police. And then what? Foster care. Questions she couldn't answer. The end of her freedom. But if she didn't approach him, that little boy would stay deaf forever. Sophia's decision came in the space between heartbeats. Sophia knew exactly what was wrong, but she also knew what would happen if she approached a biker's son uninvited. She had seconds to decide. Stay safe and invisible, or risk everything to help. One moment, she was frozen on that bench, paralyzed by fear and self-preservation. The next, her body was moving before her mind could talk her out of it. Mason had stepped off the swing and was wandering toward the slide. He was maybe 15 feet away from Sophia now. Sophia started walking toward him, her heart hammering so violently in her chest she thought it might crack her ribs. Every survival instinct screamed at her to stop, to sit back down, to stay invisible, but she kept walking. Mason turned slightly, noticing the girl approaching. He tilted his head, curious but not afraid. He couldn't hear her footsteps, couldn't hear the urgency in her breathing. Rick saw too. The reaction was immediate and primal. Rick's body shifted between Sophia and Mason before conscious thought even registered. His hand came up, palm out, a barrier of flesh and authority. "Hey!" Rick's voice cut through the afternoon air like a blade. "Back up!" Sophia stopped immediately, her hands raised slightly, showing she meant no harm, but she didn't back away. Her eyes were locked on Mason, specifically on his right ear. "I'm sorry," Sophia said quickly, her voice higher than she wanted it to be, cracking slightly with nervousness. "I'm sorry, but please." "I said back up, kid." Rick's tone left no room for negotiation, but Sophia shook her head, the movement quick and desperate. "Please," she repeated, and this time, there was something in her voice that made Rick hesitate. Not fear, not manipulation, just raw, genuine concern. "Something's in his ear. I can see it. I think I can help." Rick's jaw tightened. His hand shot out and grabbed Sophia's wrist. Not violently, but firmly. A warning and a restraint all at once. "You've got 5 seconds to explain yourself," Rick said quietly, the kind of quiet that was more threatening than shouting. Sophia looked up at him, those sharp eyes meeting Rick's without flinching. "There's something stuck in his ear," Sophia said, speaking fast but clearly. "A blockage deep in the canal. I can see it from here when the light hits right. It's been there a long time. That's why he keeps touching it. That's why he tilts his head. I've helped with this before. I know what to do. Please, just let me try. If you're holding your breath right now, you're not alone. Hit that like button if you want to see this girl prove everyone wrong." Rick stared at her. His grip on Sophia's wrist didn't loosen, but something shifted in his expression. Doubt, maybe, or desperate hope wearing the disguise of skepticism. Mason stood there between them, unaware of the tension, his hand once again drifting to his ear. Rick made his decision. He didn't release Sophia's wrist. Not yet. But he stepped aside just enough to give the girl a narrow path to his son. Sophia moved slowly, deliberately, every motion telegraphed and careful. Mason watched her with curious eyes, his head tilted in that familiar way. "I need to look in his ear," Sophia said softly. "I won't hurt him, I promise." Rick's grip on Sophia's wrist tightened for just a moment. a final warning, and then loosened slightly. Sophia knelt down, bringing herself to Mason's eye level. She smiled at him, trying to look reassuring despite her nervousness. Mason smiled back, innocent and trusting. Sophia leaned in closer. Her right hand came up, fingers extended, approaching Mason's right ear with the kind of precision that seemed impossible for a 10-year-old girl. Rick stood over them both, his body coiled tight as a spring, his hands still wrapped around Sophia's wrist. One wrong move, one indication that this kid meant harm, one cry from Mason, and Rick would pull her away so fast her feet would leave the ground. But Sophia's fingers were steady. She tilted Mason's head just slightly, angling it to catch the afternoon sunlight. And there it was, the dark mass visible now that she was close enough. Hardened wax and debris compacted over years, lodged deep against his eardrum. Sophia's index finger and thumb moved into position, slow, careful. Her touch was feather-light as she made contact with the obstruction. Mason's eyes widened slightly at the sensation. Foreign, strange, but not painful. Rick's breathing stopped entirely. Sophia began to pull, not roughly, not quickly, just steady, gentle pressure, easing the mass free from where it had been wedged for who knows how long. Seconds stretched into eternity. The obstruction resisted at first, held in place by years of compression. Sophia adjusted her angle slightly, her young face a mask of concentration. And then it moved. The thick, compact mass began to slide free, millimeter by millimeter, drawn out by Sophia's careful extraction. It was larger than Rick expected, darker, coated in old wax and debris that had accumulated and hardened into something that looked almost solid. Sophia held it in her fingers for just a moment. Proof, evidence, the answer to 6 years of medical failures. And then it fell away. Silence, a beat of absolute nothing. Mason stood completely still, his eyes unfocused, his expression frozen somewhere between confusion and fear. Something had changed. Something fundamental. And then his breath hitched, a sharp, sudden intake of air that had nothing to do with breathing and everything to do with shock. His eyes widened, pupils dilating, his entire body going rigid with the overwhelming sensation of sound flooding into his consciousness for the first time in his life. The breeze rustled through the oak trees at the edge of the park. Children laughed on the far side of the playground, their voices carrying across the open space like bells. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Rick exhaled sharply, a sound of tension and disbelief and desperate hope all mixed together. And Mason heard it all. His hands flew to his ears, both of them, as if trying to confirm that the sensation was real. His lips trembled, his chin quivered. Tears spilled down his cheeks, hot and fast and unstoppable. He looked up at his father, this man he'd known his entire life but had never truly heard. "Daddy," he whispered, the words shaped by memory, but heard for the very first time. "I hear you." Rick Ironside Fletcher had been in bar fights that left men unconscious. He'd ridden through thunderstorms that turned highways into rivers. He'd buried brothers who died too young and stood at gravesides without shedding a tear. But hearing his son say, "I hear you," for the first time in his life broke him completely. His knees went weak, actually weak. He released Sophia's wrist, forgot he was even holding it, and dropped into a crouch in front of Mason. His hands reached for his son's face, needing to see his eyes, needing to confirm this was real. Mason's hands were still pressed against his ears, fingers trembling. His entire body vibrating with the overwhelming sensation of a world that had suddenly become alive with sound. "Daddy," he said again, and this time he heard himself say it, his own voice. The sound shocked him so much he gasped, which made another sound, which made him gasp again. He started crying, not from pain or fear, but from the sheer magnitude of everything flooding into his consciousness at once. "I can hear," he whispered, testing the words, hearing them vibrate in his throat and emerge into the air as something real. "Daddy, I can hear me, I can hear you, I can hear everything." Rick pulled Mason into his arms and held him so tight it probably hurt. Tears poured down his face. Not quiet tears, but the kind that come from somewhere deep in the chest. from a place that holds 6 years of helplessness and frustration. "The leaves," Mason said, his voice muffled against his father's leather jacket. "Daddy, the leaves are making noise. And the wind. And that dog. Is that a dog?" Rick couldn't speak. His throat had closed completely. All he could do was nod and hold him and cry. And then he remembered Sophia. Rick looked up, his vision blurred with tears, and found the girl standing a few feet away. She'd backed up after the extraction, giving them space, her bare feet shifting nervously on the dusty ground. 6 years, thousands of dollars, dozens of specialists with impressive degrees and expensive equipment, and a barefoot 10-year-old girl did what none of them could. When Rick finally spoke, his voice shook, not from anger, not from intimidation, but from gratitude so profound it changed the texture of every word. "Kid," Rick breathed, barely getting the word out. "You just changed my son's life." Sophia shrugged slightly, almost apologetically, her eyes dropping to the ground. "I just wanted to help," she said quietly. "If you believe this girl deserves everything after what she just did, comment Sophia is a hero. If you think kids like her should never be homeless, share this story." Rick wiped his face with the back of his hand, smearing tears across weathered skin. And in that moment, looking at this skinny, barefoot girl who'd given him a miracle, Rick made a decision that would change 3 lives forever. Rick's hands moved to his shoulders, fingers finding the worn leather of his Hell's Angels vest. The cut, the sacred garment that represented everything he was, everything he had earned over decades of loyalty and brotherhood. He lifted it off. The movement was slow, deliberate, ceremonial. Sophia watched with wide eyes, not understanding what was happening, her body tensing as if preparing to run. Rick stepped forward, closing the distance between them in 2 strides, and then he draped the vest over Sophia's small shoulders. The leather swallowed the girl. It hung past her waist, the armholes gaping, the bottom hem nearly reaching her knees. Sophia stood there frozen, her thin frame barely filling a quarter of the space that Rick's broad shoulders had occupied moments before. "You're not alone anymore," Rick said, his voice rough but steady now, each word carefully placed like stones building a foundation. "You stay with us now." Sophia's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her eyes went glassy with tears she was trying desperately not to shed. Her hands came up slowly, fingers touching the leather as if it might disappear. I can't." Sophia's voice cracked completely. "I'm nobody. I'm just—" "You're my son's miracle," Rick interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "That makes you family. And family doesn't sleep on park benches. Family doesn't go hungry. Family doesn't survive. Family lives. You understand me?" Sophia nodded, though her face suggested she didn't quite believe what was happening. Mason pulled away from his father just enough to look at Sophia, his face still wet with tears but lit up with joy. "You're staying?" he asked, his voice full of wonder and hope. Sophia looked down at him, then back at Rick, then down at the vest drowning her small frame. "I'm staying," she whispered. Rick placed his hand on top of Sophia's head, the gesture somewhere between a blessing and a claim. This girl was his now, his responsibility, his family. "We'll get you cleaned up," Rick said, his mind already moving through logistics. "Get you fed. Get you home." Home. Sophia had forgotten what that word meant. Word traveled fast in the Hell's Angels. Rick made one phone call from the park to his vice president, a man named Dutch. "Bring everyone to the clubhouse," Rick said. "I need the brothers to meet someone." Within an hour, motorcycles began rolling into the parking lot of the Hell's Angels clubhouse on the east side of Portland. The rumble of engines announced each arrival, deep, throaty roars that vibrated through the walls. These were men society had labeled as dangerous, as outlaws, as people to be feared. And they were all gathering to meet a 10-year-old homeless girl. Sophia stood in the corner of the clubhouse common room, still wearing Rick's oversized vest, trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. Mason sat beside her on a worn couch, his hand clasped in hers, refusing to let go. The bikers filed in, massive men with scarred knuckles and weathered faces. Men who'd seen violence and survived it. They looked at Sophia with expressions that made the girl's stomach clench with fear. But then Rick told them the story. He stood in the center of the room, Mason on his hip now, and explained everything. The 6 years of silence, the failed doctors, the park, Sophia's observation, the extraction. Mason's first words after hearing sound. "This kid," Rick said, his voice carrying absolute conviction, "gave my son something I couldn't buy. Something specialists with fancy degrees couldn't provide. She gave him the world." The room fell silent. One of the older bikers, a man called Hammer, stepped forward. He looked Sophia up and down, taking in the bare feet, the dirty clothes, the fear barely hidden behind defensive eyes. "How old are you, kid?" Hammer asked, his voice gravelly. 10, Sophia answered quietly. Hammer nodded slowly. Then he looked at Rick. "She got people? Family somewhere?" "No," Rick said simply. "She's been surviving on her own for 2 years." Something shifted in the room. The atmosphere changed in a way that was almost tangible. These men who rarely trusted outsiders, who'd been rejected by society themselves, who'd built their own family precisely because the world had pushed them out. They didn't see Sophia as charity. They saw themselves in her. Dutch, the vice president, spoke next. "President's making her family," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "Anyone got a problem with that?" Silence. Then Hammer stepped forward again, this time approaching Sophia directly. The girl tensed, every muscle preparing to run. Hammer extended his hand. "Welcome home, kid," he said simply. Sophia stared at the offered hand for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether this was real. Then slowly she reached out and shook it. Her small hand disappeared completely inside Hammer's calloused grip. One by one, the other bikers stepped forward. Each one shook Sophia's hand. Each one welcomed her. "We'll set her up in the back room," someone said. "Kid needs clothes," another added. "I've got nieces about her size. I'll bring some things tomorrow." "School," a third voice chimed in. "She'll need to get enrolled." The logistics came fast, each brother offering something practical, something concrete. This wasn't charity. This was a brotherhood absorbing a new member, making space in their lives for someone who needed them. By the end of the evening, Sophia had a room at the clubhouse. Not a cot in a corner, but an actual room with a door that locked from the inside and a bed with clean sheets. She had protection. She had structure. She had family. Remember, Sophia never begged, never stole. She survived by helping, and now, for the first time, people were helping her back. Sophia's first night in the clubhouse, she didn't sleep. She lay in that bed with clean sheets and a pillow that didn't smell like mildew, staring at the ceiling, waiting for someone to tell her it was all a mistake. But morning came and no one told her to go. Rick knocked on her door at 7, carrying a plate of eggs and toast. Sophia ate slowly, still not quite trusting that the food wouldn't be taken away. "You'll need boots," Rick said. "Can't have you walking around barefoot anymore." By noon, Sophia had boots, real ones. She had jeans that fit, t-shirts that didn't have holes, a jacket for when the Portland nights got cold. The transformation wasn't just external. Over the following weeks, the Brotherhood absorbed Sophia into their daily rhythm. Hammer taught her how engines worked, how to rebuild a carburetor with patience and precision. Dutch took her to the motorcycle safety course, explaining road rules. Another brother, a quiet man named Rev, taught her about honor, about keeping your word. "You never begged," Rev said one afternoon while they were cleaning bikes. "You never stole. You survived by helping people. That's why you're here, kid. Not because we felt sorry for you, but because you've got character." Rick enrolled her in school, the local elementary, 5th grade. Sophia had missed significant chunks of education, but she caught up fast. Her teachers noticed something unusual about her, a maturity beyond her years, a kindness toward other kids who seemed lost or alone. During lunch, Sophia would seek out the children sitting by themselves and ask if she could join them. She recognized isolation because she'd lived it. If this is making you emotional, you're human. Subscribe if you believe every child deserves this kind of second chance. By the time October rolled into November, Sophia had been with the Brotherhood for 6 weeks. She had routine, stability. She woke up in the same bed every morning, ate meals at regular times, did homework at the clubhouse dining table. She had a life, but there was one part of her new reality that meant more to her than all the rest combined. One ritual that happened every single evening without fail, and it involved the little boy who'd been the catalyst for everything. Every evening at 7:30 without fail, Mason would appear at Sophia's door. He'd knock, three soft taps that he could finally hear himself making, and wait for her to answer. When she opened the door, he'd be standing there in his pajamas, his favorite stuffed bear tucked under one arm, his eyes bright with anticipation. "Is it time?" he'd ask. "It's time," Sophia would reply, smiling. And then Mason would take her hand and lead her to the clubhouse common room, to the old couch near the window, and they'd sit together in the gathering darkness while he discovered the world. It had started accidentally that first week after the park. Mason had been overwhelmed by sound. Every noise was new, every sensation unfamiliar and sometimes frightening. So Sophia had sat with him one evening and started naming things, identifying sounds, giving him context for the chaos flooding his senses. "That's the refrigerator," she'd said, pointing toward the kitchen. "It hums because of the motor inside." Mason had listened, his head tilted, focusing on the soft electrical hum he'd never known existed. "And that?" he'd asked, pointing toward the window. "Crickets," Sophia had answered. "Little insects outside. They rubbed their legs together to make that chirping sound." His face had lit up with wonder, and so it became their ritual. Every night Mason would sit beside Sophia, his tiny fingers tugging at her sleeve whenever he heard something new. "Sophia, what's that sound?" became the question that shaped their evenings together. Sophia was endlessly patient. She never seemed annoyed by his constant questions. "That's someone walking upstairs. You can tell by the rhythm. That's wind chimes from the house next door. Little metal tubes that make music when the breeze moves them. That's your own laughter, Mason. That's what joy sounds like when it comes out of you." That last one had made him laugh even harder, delighted by the discovery that happiness had a sound, and that sound was his. The reversal wasn't lost on Rick, who often watched them from across the room. The girl who'd once been invisible, who'd survived in corners and alleys with no one to talk to, was now teaching, guiding, becoming someone's bridge to understanding. And the boy who'd lived in silence was now asking questions, engaging, discovering that sound gave dimension to everything he'd only seen before. They needed each other in ways that went beyond gratitude or obligation. Sophia gave Mason context. Mason gave Sophia purpose. Together, they were healing wounds neither of them had words for. 6 months changed everything. It was March when the Brotherhood gathered for their monthly family dinner, a tradition that had taken on new meaning since Sophia joined them. The clubhouse dining area was packed, long tables pushed together, mismatched chairs filled with bikers and their families. Sophia sat in the middle of it all, surrounded by men who'd become her uncles, her teachers, her protectors. She wore a new vest now, not Rick's oversized cut, but one made specifically for her. Leather still stiff and unmarked, but bearing a small patch that read, "Little Sister," across the back. Mason sat beside her, as he always did, chattering excitedly about something that had happened at school. Rick watched them from across the room, a beer in his hand, a smile on his face. Dutch stood beside him. "You did good, Prez," he said quietly. Rick shook his head. "Sophia did good. I just recognized it." The dinner continued. Food passed. Stories shared. The kind of easy chaos that comes when family gathers without pretense. Sophia was laughing at something Hammer had said. Her face lit up in a way that erased every trace of the scared barefoot girl from the park. And then Mason stood up on his chair. The movement caught everyone's attention. Conversations paused. Heads turned. Mason cupped his hands around his mouth, took a deep breath, and shouted at the top of his lungs, "I love you, Sophia!" His voice carried through the entire clubhouse, clear and strong, and filled with every ounce of affection a child's heart could hold. And this time, unlike every other time he'd tried to express love in his life, he heard himself say it. The room went completely silent. Sophia's face crumpled, just completely fell apart. Tears streamed down her cheeks before she could even try to stop them, her shoulders shaking with the force of emotion she'd been holding back for months. maybe years, maybe her entire life. Because Sophia had never heard those words before. Not once. Not from her father before he died. Not from her mother before she left. Not from anyone in the 2 years she'd spent invisible and alone. She'd survived by being unwanted, by being forgettable, by accepting that love was something other people had, not something meant for her. But Mason, this little boy whose world she'd opened with one careful extraction, was shouting his love for her loud enough for everyone to hear. And she meant it, and he could hear it. Sophia couldn't speak, could barely breathe. She just sat there crying while Mason climbed down from his chair and threw his arms around her neck, holding her with the fierce protectiveness of a little brother who'd claimed her as his own. Rick moved then, crossed the room in 3 long strides, and placed his hand on Sophia's shoulder. Heavy, warm, unmistakable in its meaning. "You're my daughter now," Rick said, his voice thick with emotion. "Both of you are my children." Sophia looked up at him, tears still streaming, and nodded because words were impossible. "If you're crying, hit that like button. You're not alone. If you believe love like this should be shared, send this to someone who needs to remember that miracles are real." The girl who lived in corners was now at the center of everything. The boy who lived in silence now filled every room with sound. And the family that had formed in a park on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon was now unbreakable. 3 years have passed since that afternoon in the park. Sophia's 13 now. She's taller, her bare feet long since replaced by boots she wears with pride. She's in 8th grade at Portland Middle School, at the top of her class every semester. But more than that, she's become the kid who notices others, who finds the students eating lunch alone and sits with them, who helps struggling classmates, who sees the invisible children because she used to be one. Mason is 9 now, thriving in ways that seemed impossible just 3 years ago. His hearing remains fully functional. He's learning piano, joined the school choir, spends his afternoons discovering music, and every single night he still sits with Sophia. Not to ask, "What's that sound?" anymore. He knows most of them now, but simply to be near the person who gave him everything. But the story didn't end with Sophia and Mason. 6 months after Sophia moved into the clubhouse, Rick called a formal meeting of the Portland chapter. All members present. "We've got space here," Rick had said. "We've got resources. We've got brothers who know what it's like to be forgotten. So here's what I'm proposing. We start a program for homeless kids." The vote was unanimous. They called it Sophia's Law. Not a legal statute, but a code within their chapter. A commitment that any child in genuine need would have a place with them. Within a year, 3 more children had found homes within the Brotherhood. A 15-year-old boy who'd been couch surfing after aging out of foster care. Twin girls whose father had died. A 14-year-old who'd run from an abusive household. Each one was given structure, protection, education, and belonging. The Portland chapter's initiative made local news, then regional news. And that's when something unexpected happened. 3 other motorcycle clubs across Oregon, chapters that had no formal affiliation with the Hells Angels, reached out to Rick. They'd seen the coverage, read the stories, and they wanted to do the same thing. Sophia's story inspired 3 other motorcycle clubs in Oregon to do the same thing. Dozens of homeless children now have families because one girl was brave enough to help a little boy in a park. The Vagos in Eugene, the Mongols in Salem, an independent club called the Cascade Riders in Bend. All of them started their own versions of the program. All of them opened their clubhouses and their lives to children who needed them. Within 3 years, 47 children across Oregon had found families through motorcycle clubs. 47 kids who'd been invisible, forgotten, or abandoned now had homes. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. These clubs, organizations that society often painted as dangerous, were doing more for vulnerable children than most government programs. They weren't doing it for recognition or tax breaks or positive publicity. They were doing it because they understood what it meant to be cast out, to be judged, to be told you don't matter. Rick was asked about it once during a local news interview that Sophia and Mason watched from the clubhouse couch. "Mr. Fletcher, why do you think your organization has been so successful with these children when traditional systems struggle?" Rick had thought about it for a moment, then answered simply, because we don't see them as problems to be solved. We see them as people who deserve a family. And maybe that's all any kid really needs, someone who sees them. But later that night, after the cameras left and the clubhouse settled into its evening rhythm, Rick said something different, something quieter, something true. Sophia was doing homework at the dining table. Mason was practicing piano in the corner. The brotherhood was scattered throughout the building, living their lives in the comfortable chaos of family. Rick stood in the doorway, watching all of it, and Dutch heard him whisper, "I thought I was saving her. Turns out she saved all of us." This story proves that the smallest act of kindness can change everything. If you believe people like Sophia and Mason deserve to be celebrated, smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Comment "Thank you, Sophia" down below if this story moved you. And if you know someone who's struggling, who feels invisible, share this video with them. Let them know they matter. Let them know their story isn't over. Because sometimes miracles don't just happen to one person. Sometimes they ripple outward, touching lives we'll never even know about. And it all started with a barefoot girl, a deaf little boy, and 30 seconds in a park that changed everything.